I'm Paul Sullivan, your host on the Company of Dads podcast, where we explore the sweet, sublime, silly, and strange aspects of being a lead dad in a world where the role still isn't considered normal. While most of the childcare is done by moms and paid caregivers, lead dads, whether we work full-time, part-time, or devote all of our time to our families, are here to step up and help. The Company of Dads is here to bring together other lead dads and to show that what we're doing is good for fathers, mothers, and the whole family system. Today, my guests are Brian Anderson and John Badalament, two of the dads behind Fathering Together, a nonprofit that works to make fathers agents of positive change. One of its missions is to give dads a tool to try to be the best fathers they can be. And they back up their mission with research and data that shows how more involved fathers benefit the entire family. Brian has recently shifted from executive director to president of Fathering Together, and John is the director of education. Between us, we have 6 daughters and 1 son. Brian and John, welcome to the Company of Dads podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, first question. Which one of you is a better father?
Very tough. We're at such different stages. Right now, Brian may be, but because I have 2 teenagers, late stage teenagers. So Brian is yet to sort of go across a bunch of minefields, but yeah, I'm going to go with that.
All right.
Yes. He's got quantity of years. I've got quality of years. We'll put it that way.
Wow.
Wow. Shot across.
Wow is right, huh?
Shot across
right
the
back
bow.
at you, buddy.
Wow.
You gotta start it in quick and early. You gotta get him in.
Oh, my God. All right. Peacemaker here. There's a third member of Fathering Together, Chris Lewis. How did you guys start working together on what's an amazing organization with a first-rate mission?
Yeah, Chris Lewis gets credit for the kind of the impetus of the group, which started on Facebook as Dads with Daughters. I get credit for the name because I was meeting with guys locally here in Evanston, and I just called ourselves Fathering Together because no one had that domain name. And then when we realized this was, something that needed to be bigger than a Facebook community, I offered up the name because we already had, the rights of Fathering Together. And it fit more of the mission of what we wanted to accomplish in that sense of bringing dads together from various stages of life and varying makeups of life. We have all manner of dads in our network. And so Chris and I put in motion the nonprofit piece, and we realized neither one of us at the time wanted to do this full time. We had great full-time jobs. This was kind of our side thing. And John had this wealth of history working with men and dads and the educational background to really help create and hone the products we wanted to offer. And so thankfully, John was in a place to transition into something new, and we brought him on 2.5 years ago, I think.
Somewhere in there.
21? Yeah.
It's hard to know because it was a process, but yeah.
It was during COVID, so everything's a bit of a blur in COVID, but we got our 501c3 designation in June of 2020, and it's been a slow build ever since, connecting with dads all over the world. And it's been an awesome experience so far.
Yeah. I mean, lots to unpack here, but going back to the Facebook group, am I correct that it's the largest group for fathers on Facebook?
I haven't checked this week. We go back and forth with an organization called A Bunch of Dads. Great group of guys over there. And both of us were highlighted during Facebook's More Together campaign back in 2019, 2000. And so both of our membership kind of grew exponentially. We only focused on dads who had daughters in our primary group, while theirs is a open network for all dads. So we can say we're in the top 2-3 largest dad groups. Keep us a little humble. Yeah.
Fair enough. But with that start on Facebook, and it is quite a diverse group of dads. When you look at, and men historically are not great at communicating, not great at sharing. How have you used that Facebook group to, bring men together and help them? I mean, what part of your mission statement is to, provide tools to dads who not all of us have the best tools, and to sort of support them. So how has that Facebook group been instrumental in that part of your mission?
I think it was kind of right place, right time on some level, because we were in the midst of a pandemic. There weren't a lot of options to meet in person. And people were starving for connection, starving for answers of how to get through COVID, how to get through this life. And we created a space for camaraderie that was as free as you can from trolling and negativity. We really put it upon our membership to say this is a place of empowerment and encouragement rather than shooting dads down that maybe made a mistake or were looking for support. And by doing so, I think that really helps our community grow and offered opportunities to build those bridges through Zoom, through Facebook, through posts. We did a virtual dad-daughter dance where we invited one of our members who's a DJ just to play in the group live from his studio, or home studio, I should say. And I think it was just a way to kind of like goof around and imagine fatherhood differently. We had some members that did arts and crafts with their daughters, and so they just went live and taught dads how to do things, and their daughter was right beside them. Yeah. We had another dad teaching salsa lessons, I believe, for a few weeks in a row with his daughters. And so we just kind of made it a playground, albeit a virtual one, for dads to connect. And I think that really drove our membership in those early months.
John, you came on in you call it June 2020, and that's a moment that I remember well. I mean, that's when the pandemic became, real. We all sort of went in lockdown in March, and we're like, well, I don't know, this thing's probably not going to last, and then it lasts. And then it's like, holy cow, this is, and I live outside of New York City. So this was sort of, the epicenter for the early part of the pandemic. And it was horrifying. But during that time, personally, that's when I got the idea for the company of dads as a way to, bring together lead dads, working dads, allies for moms. And it took me, a year or so to sort of leave the Times and actually do that. But when you came on in that sort of, mid 2020, call it, to be the director of education, what were you hoping to do? Like, what was your goal in coming on then? And you do, you and I know each other well. We've joked a lot, but you do have quite a pedigree in education and working with men and fathers. So what was your hope and your goal when you joined in 2020?
It's an interesting, I mean, it's a tough question because initially being virtual, I mean, well, my hope's always been the same, to build curriculum and programming for dads in any setting, really. So initially it was virtual. I mean, my hope was always, my intention was always to get dads together in any way we can and wherever they are. So at that point, it was online. In years past, it's been, where are they? They're in schools, they're in jails, they're in bars. Where do you find dads? So that initially it was, how do we do this? How do we build programming for this group that we all feel good about? And Chris and Brian, we were all aligned very much. And that's what sort of started the conversation with what we wanted to provide for dads. So one is a space and a forum, a place to gather, which is, I'm sure we'll talk about that, is hugely important. And then two is trying to build confidence in dads, trying to build competence, more skills, and connection. So that's sort of the three things I always focus on.
Mm-hmm. One of my recent guests runs a consultancy in the UK around, working parents. And one of his lines is, they don't teach dad in school. And I thought that's a really powerful line. They don't teach dad in school. And here he was, a guy who, was trying to go at it the right way, trying to do all the right things. But when he's a father of three, when he first got into it, he's like, boy, I'm not quite sure what to do. And when you think, and this could be for either of you, you both answer the question, but when you think of like the key things that if we could teach dad in school, if we could educate fathers to be just good fathers, you don't have to be great fathers, but just good fathers, what would be some of those key points that we should teach, or at least at this point get across to men who become fathers?
Well, can I take this one? Just start it.
Yeah.
So because I was just talking about this yesterday. I was talking about it in the context of healthcare with one of the health centers here in Boston. They're doing a big project. I just learned about this yesterday, to somewhat ironic, but to strengthen maternal health, and specifically sort of help with the disparities with infant mortality that we have going on with Black and Latina women, mothers. And so I'll bring this back around. The project they're doing to help, they were, put together a bunch of leaders and saying, what can we do to change these outcomes, these health outcomes, ultimately for these babies? And this part of the project evolved into, we need men, we need dads. They're basically an untapped resource to support, because we know research shows when dads are there for the pregnancy, when they support the mom, everybody does better. They do better, the dads do, the moms do, and the child outcomes are better. So working backwards, they started talking about how do we get dads, how do we get men to show up all the way down the line here? And where it led to was, which seems very obvious to me, much earlier. We have to have these conversations about fatherhood much earlier, which brought me to thinking about a pilot that I did years ago with Mass General Hospital called the Fatherhood Project. We went into a high school, a local high school, and through the health curriculum, it was a pilot, so we did different groups. We did some that were single gendered and then mixed gendered groups. And the thrust of our program was to ask the question, what does it mean to be a good dad? And and this for high school boys and high school girls as well. And it was just fascinating, because the number one thing we learned, of course, was that nobody's ever asked that question. We've never talked about fathers or fatherhood at this age. And I would argue I'd like to see it go younger, but just starting the conversation, it is so critical, because what they came up with, to answer your question, is they were reflective. I think we need to teach boys and men to reflect, not just act. Mm-hmm. It's a combination of acting and reflecting. To all the things you would think, to communicate, to talk about what they learn about themselves. But it just stuck with me to sit there and listen to these boys talk about, about their own fathers, the father they want to be. That was the name of the project, the father you want to be. And the reality is most of them are going to be fathers. I think the statistics, around 80% of them will go on to be biological fathers. All of them are of a father figure, or will be a father figure, in many cases already are by high school. And the second thing was listening to watching the girls and what they had to say about what these boys were saying was fascinating. So
when you asked that question though, what does it mean to be a good father? And you said, of course, it kind of stumped them. They hadn't really thought about that. But after they reflected on it, did they come up with any conclusions, or did you guide them into sort of X, Y, and Z?
Yeah, I mean, they came up with a lot. They definitely weren't stumped for long. And, we addressed kind of the elephant in the living room that we know not everybody here has a great father. Not everybody here has a father. Not everybody has a close relationship. So we acknowledge there's all kinds of experiences, but they were united in, all had a real kind of a passion to say for what they wanted, the sort of aspirational. They wanted to be a father that was close to their kids, my language, connection. They wanted to be responsible. They gave some pretty powerful answers, and the answers in themselves were interesting, because here it is, boys talking about something, their feelings, their hopes, without making it an exercise about talking about your feelings. I think that's what was so interesting to all of us, but in particular the girls. They're I've never seen these guys talk like this. And that's kind of the work we do at Fathering Together, and all of us do with dads, is we just want to, get together and reflect and share what's going on inside of you. So I think that they came up with all kinds of really yeah, like I said, passionate responses as to what they wanted. Now we did guide them. We gave, there were like 5 sort of, I don't remember what we call them, 5 principles or something about showing up, about responsibility, and just had them reflect on those. And so it was a combination of guiding them and really going with where they were headed, what they thought, because we didn't want to tell them, here's what you need to do.
Right.
But at the same time, we wanted to make use of it, you know, and say, these are some things they knew what wasn't working, whether it was because of their own personal experience or what they had seen, or because they had a great dad. So,
you know, Brian, listen to John's response here. I mean, this is sort of it's a wonderful story, but it's the setup, of course, is let's try to get to these kids in high school, presumably before, you know, most or all of them have become, you know, fathers. But when, you know, we're on the Fathering Together, you know, Facebook page, there are a lot of questions there of fathers asking, sort of in extreme situations, what do I do? You know, and it's clear that they went into this thinking it would be different than it turned out to be, and they're struggling. When you see that on this very sort of powerful Facebook group you've created, how do you get in there and help? What are some of the bits of advice you give to help these fathers who didn't have the good fortune of being in a class that John was teaching in high school, to sort of think about it before it happened, but to actually have to react and then course correct once they become fathers and realize that they're struggling?
Yeah, it's interesting. My dad had that kind of distant dad. Like I don't have much of a relationship, or didn't have much of a relationship with my grandfather either. And I would often ask my dad, like, how did you turn out so good? And how did you know to raise me the way you did? And learning by bad examples isn't going to cut it, right? It might get you so far. And he said, you know, like, I had an uncle, I had my mom, your grandma, like, kind of tell me, but he did a lot of research. And this was like, you know, in the early 80s, late 70s, when there wasn't a lot of masculinity or fatherhood research.
Yeah.
But I think that now that there is, you know, part of it, depending on the dad, is I point them, like, do some research, right? Like, read books. There's so many great books out there on healthy parenting, not let alone healthy fatherhood. But my tact for most dads, regardless of where they're coming from, regardless of the color of their collar or anything, is to help them understand the skills they already have. And most of us have been taught to have a career, right? Pour yourself into your work. And a lot of that comes with professional development workshops around team management, right? Like, how do you run your team?
Yeah, if you stink at your job, people aren't going to fire you right away. Chances are they'll put you into some sort of professional development and give you a chance. But I think I see where you're going with this. If you stink at being a father, there isn't the equivalent professional development. Is that? There's
not. No, but how do we help dads translate those emotional intelligence skill sets, the communication that they have with their team that has gotten their product on a shelf somewhere, or their product, you know, highlighted in a magazine, you know, or not even a product, right? Their consultancy, right? Like, whatever a dad is doing really well in the office, chances are there's ways to translate that into the home and respond to their child with a long-term outcome in mind, right? Like, most of us aren't going to just switch off fatherhood hat at 18 when our kids go off to college or become legal adults. Like, we're in it for the long haul. And so you can't just fire a kid. You can't just say, like, F it, go to your room and never talk to me, right? Like, no, there has to be appropriate conversations. You have to make teachable moments, much like we do in the office. Because you're right, we don't fire people on a first offense 99% of the time, right? You take a chance on them and say, hey, we hired you for a reason. We want you to grow. We trust in your skill set. You just made a wrong decision. Same goes with our kids, except that they've never made those decisions before, or they've never experienced, I don't know, snow or going to school. And so how do you guide your child, and how do you get on their level, right? Like, how do we remind ourselves that we're 6 foot, 5.5 foot, whatever, they're 2 feet. When we talk to them, they're scared, or they're put in an inferior position. And so how do we find ways to level the playing field, to get on their level and empathize with the fear they're experiencing, or also the joys and the excitement of that first adventure they get with their dad.
You know, that's such a, I've got a follow-up question for you, Brian, but that's such a good point. My kids are 5, 10, and 13, and my 13-year-old is, you know, I'm 5'11" and 3/4. That 3/4 is important. But she's, you know, 5'5", and with her, I maybe will sit down on the edge of something when we are having a tough conversation. But with my 5-year-old and my 10-year-old, I 100%, like you're saying, they literally get down to their level so that I'm not, you know, also literally, you know, talking down to them. One of the things you did recently, Brian, which had you asked me ahead of time, I would have advised you against, is write a book. And I say that because I've written a couple books. One went really well. The second one, not so well. Talk to me about the impetus for it. And it's a great book. It's got some clear takeaways. Talk to me about a few of those takeaways that you'd want to share with the listeners.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if I'll write another book, at least not by myself, or maybe co-writing is worse. I don't know. But I failed to write 3 books with co-writers, but I did get paid for them. So it is worse, but you get paid, but you don't have anything to show for, at least if you're me. Good to know. I had a mentor tell me, never write a book unless you can't fall asleep at night because of the stories running through your head or the points you want to make. And it got to the point where I was having so many conversations with dads and so many common themes were coming out. And I just couldn't find a book to reference or to recommend in every situation. I mean, there's so many great books, right? But for me, again, coming from this idea of translating our workplace skills into the home, servant leadership has been well documented. There's so many books by corporate leaders and consultants on.
In one sentence for the listeners, explain to us what servant leadership is. Servant
leadership is basically a CEO making themselves available and listening to their staff to grow their staff in trust and experience so that they do a great job, thus making it easier for the CEO to tell the shareholders we've got, you know, the profit or whatever. And in many respects, dads are CEOs or co-CEOs of their home. And how do we see our children as the potential that they are? How are we building cathedrals, as I once said, rather than fixing holes in the wall? And how are we providing opportunities for them to grow and flourish? And most of the dads I would interview did that fairly well. You know, we all have our great 75% days, but very rarely are we all on 100% of the time. And so I basically said, okay, here are the tenets of servant leadership around emotional intelligence, advocating, looking to the future and creating opportunities to reach those goals, all of that stuff. I kind of put it through the lens of fatherhood and said, okay, as dads, how are we doing that pre-work? How are we doing the mental internal work before we even become dads to make sure that we're ready and do things beyond just build the crib? Yeah. How are we communicating? How are we empathizing? How are we putting ourselves in a place of lifelong learnership? Because it's so much fun to relearn things through the eyes of our children. And even if I've built Lego bricks 50,000 times, going back and building it with my daughter, definitely some headaches, but it was a hell of a lot more fun to play with afterwards, right? Because we built that story together. And I think ultimately at the end of this day, I wanted a book that told dads, you can read every book in the world, including mine, but the most important book and manual you have is the one you co-create with your children. And my book is just giving some perspectives on how to get there if you hadn't given it thought before.
I think about that, and I loved playing checkers as a kid, but checkers is you know, inferior to chess. You can't go on playing. And now with my daughters, we have bought like a wooden checkerboard, like a nice checkerboard, not the, you know, cardboard ones that I had that would break. And it's so much fun to play with them. But you're right, like, you know, I'm not gonna have you guys over and have a couple beers. Like, okay, guys, let's break out the checkers. Here we go. But we get to the end. John, I got a question for you. I know you guys are working on a new education initiative that's going to go into schools. Talk a bit about that.
Sure. Backgammon's a good medium, by the way, between checkers.
It's actually on the other side. It's on the other side of the checkerboard. I can flip it over and we can play back. Yeah.
Perfect. There you go. And I found those 5 things, by the way. It was called Father Readiness that we taught. So do you want to hear them? What the things we talked to in the schools about to the boys about fatherhood?
Sure. Give them to me quick, but then I want to know about
this is related. I'll answer your question in this. Yeah. 1, having a vision for fatherhood, for being a father. Part of that is understanding your legacy, what you got from your own dad, and then looking forward to say, what kind of dad do you want to be? What's your vision for yourself, for a family, for a partnership, and then having a support system. And these are all, I'm talking about these. This is what we teach and what we provide activities and resources to get men to do and to think about. So yeah, the third one's have a support system, friends, family, community groups. And we pose these as questions. Are you prepared to provide education, career path, financial plans to provide needs? And then lastly is be relationally fit. Do you understand your own emotions, others' emotions, your commitments, problem solving, and basic communication? So that's what we were sort of posing those questions as guideposts for boys in the school program. At Fathering Together, we are currently piloting in schools, in elementary schools, Fathering Together chapters is what we're calling them. And essentially, the way it's working is we find a dad leader, or co-leaders, couple dads, and try and connect them with the PTA, PTO, whatever the parent organization is, so it's not necessarily a separate group. Some schools it can be a separate group, but what we found is it's when the dads are connected to the PTA, it leads to much better communication. There's not as much overlap, and also it supports the work of the PTA. And tend to find that when groups form on their own, they're not as connected to the school necessarily. So finding dad leader, connecting with the PTA, and then starting by doing a survey of the school's dads and father figures. And I should have said this at the start. When I'm using the word dad, I'm very clear that term means a lot of different things to different people, but that's meant to be in this context inclusive of father figures, grandparents, guardians, whoever someone calls as their dad. And so the focus of our chapters in the schools is to engage the dads, because most schools, one, they don't even know how if dads are involved. They might have some anecdotes, but that data is not broken down by gender, which I think the best way to look at it is go look at the PTA or the parent organization and how many dads are there. That usually gives you an indication of, I think, the general engagement in the school. And most of the time, the word parent and family still, in that context, means mom. So part of what we're doing is trying to say, yeah, we would love for parent, the word parent and the word family to really, mean that it includes dads. But unfortunately, in that setting, in a lot of settings, it doesn't necessarily do that. So we're very clear to use the word dad, father figure. Yeah. And the purpose of the chapters, the dads groups, is to get the dads engaged in three areas. One, with their kids, with their family. Mm-hmm. Two, with other dads, other parents, other moms. And then three, get them engaged in the school and in the community. Yeah. So though everything, then we break it down. They have monthly meetings. Most of the meetings are planning. They are to do 3 events during the year, in year one. And those 3 events, ideally, one is for dads and kids and families, one is for dads and other parents, and one is for dads in the schools. So an example, an event might be the dads putting together a school-wide pancake breakfast, okay, for everyone in the school. And at that, and just to make this clear, the one, I think the special sauce of this program is that we try to build in meaningful engagement within all the events and activities. So the example that is the pancake breakfast, what we do is we give them a business card that has 3 questions. So they do, depending on the age group, they do a little quiz. So it's a way to start a conversation. What is your dad's favorite food? What does your dad like to do with you? Yeah. What stresses your child out? What does your child love to do with you? So we create moments of back and forth. Not everything has to be, that way. You can do a dad-child hike and not necessarily have, but we try to make the most of those moments, you know?
I can't tell you how much I love this. This is a passion of mine. It's also a pet peeve of mine. I have 3 daughters, but I'm a 4-time class parent. And the first one started with we're still oldest daughter, but she said, Dad, will you do this? And at first I said, no way. I don't want to do that. That's all. And then my wife said, what are you doing? Like, you want to set an example,
right?
You should do it. And I said, all right. And I did it. And I recruited another dad, and there are literally 2 of us doing it at this school it's an elementary school. And so I don't even know, another maybe 40, there are 50 parents that say involved, 48 are women, and the 2 of us. And I loved it. And the guy who did it with me he never did it again. And not that I guess I'm a glutton for punishment, because you do it for one daughter, you get what we all hear, that's not fair. So I then did it for, subsequent daughters. And my youngest is in kindergarten now, and I'm the class parent, and I'm partnered with a working mom, and we have a good rapport, but there's still some things that absolutely drive me crazy. And it's, the stuff that is so easily remedied. It's, why does a school nurse, call my wife? Well, she actually doesn't anymore, because we've had so many conversations, but she did for a long time. And, the second one is, and I just wrote a post on this on LinkedIn, why do we only send the invitations to moms? And this is not just, stay-at-home moms. This is working moms who fall into this. And people have
very important point.
It's
right
so
there.
important. Like, people said, like, we could create a joint email. It's like, yeah, but I want dads to take ownership of being fathers. So
Right.
it doesn't cost you anything to add emails. It literally, they give you a list. You can copy and paste the list in there, and then they all get it. Yeah. And you go.
It's 2023. I'll remind you that's the part that, so one of the first things we do, I said a survey. The survey is actually meant it's for the dads, and it's 3 purposes. One is find out what the dads are thinking, what they're interested in, who they are. 2, it's to get their data with their permission, their email, the best way to connect them. For that very reason, the schools often, they have, a family email, they have mom's email. This is well known, and this has been going forever. And then 3, we build we ask them to build a database, get it? Database, so that there is a communication tool going directly to the dads. Again, ideally, we want this integrated and equitable and equal, but right now there's a deficit. So you have to do something about that, so that we don't have only moms get the email, or only, the nurse. I just heard the same story last week. A nurse waited 2 hours to finally get through to the dad. So his daughter was in the nurse's office for 2 hours because she couldn't reach the mom. But I think of this as it's a 2-way street. This is really important, that schools have an obligation. It's a gender equity. It's an equity, diversity, inclusion issue, right? This population, that's actually on the National PTA website. They have male engagement is an issue for DEI. It's an inclusion issue. And most schools, like I said, don't even know, because they don't track the data, if the dads are involved or not. But the 2-way street is, so schools have an obligation, I think, to reach out to guys like you and get more dads involved. Because look, the bottom line is there's so much great stuff. Your kid spends most of their time in school. If you want to connect with your kid, you want to have a strong, close connection, you better know what's going on, minimally know what's happening. And ideally, you're going in to read to the kid, to a group of kids. And don't forget, there's lots of kids who may not have a dad. That's providing another image of what a dad is, what a dad does, what a man is. There's lots of different ways to do it. So getting, the school has an obligation. We know family school partnerships, there's tons of research, and in all the research about how great it is, how great kids do when the school engages that family, all that research, there's almost nothing. There's almost nothing that breaks that word family and parent down by gender. So we're missing a huge, because a lot of dads are involved. And that's not necessarily reflected. The two-way street, though, the other part of it is we can't, as dads, can't necessarily wait around and make excuses for not being involved. And the biggest one is time. I don't have time. I'm busy. Well, you said it yourself. You're partnering with a working mom. Working moms have been doing this for forever, and so have single moms. So the idea that time is the barrier, I don't buy that. I think we make, at the end of the day, we make time for what's important. Yeah. So that two-way street is important to acknowledge. It's like schools have to invite dads, which is part of the program that we're building to help them do that. And dads, we need to just step up and realize if you want to connect with your kids, you better really look at a young age, which is important. The younger they're engaged in the school, the longer they stay engaged. So it's a great opportunity, and I think a lot of fun.
This has been great, guys. Thank you so much. I'm going to give the last question to Brian, and that is, I mean, you've been along this journey since almost the beginning with Fathering Together. You're now, transitioning to sort of a role as president, but you've accomplished a lot. You're doing great work, but what are your hopes for the future? Like, what does, Fathering Together become? What does it grow into in its effort to continue to help, fathers be the best fathers they can be?
That's a great question. And I think part of it is the school-based chapter and application for all of this data that is being collected. But on a larger level, I see Fathering Together being our title and being a collaborative space, a collective space. So the local group in Buffalo, New York, that our colleague Antoine Johnson is running for new dads in Buffalo, they can look to us and say, hey, I'm looking for a good practice for my dads. Do you know someone? And I can put them in touch with someone in Miami, or, the great guys up in Vermont with Dad Guild and Keegan Alba. Like, how are we staying connected as individuals to help us grow in that day-to-day of tantrums and potty changing and all that kind of stuff, diaper changing and potty training, all that stuff. But then also as an organizational level, how are we holding each other accountable? How are we setting standards that we can live up to? And to John's point with the school systems, how are we role modeling healthy balance in our workplaces so that if we're in a leadership position, we set an expectation that you can leave at 4:00 if you have to pick your kids up or be a coach or take a kid to a doctor's office. We're not going to penalize you and be nitpicking your hours, but really kind of using Fathering Together as a platform to set new narratives and new standards for what modern fatherhood can look like. And I not to correct you, but just to expand on something you said early on, like there's three of us behind the name of Fathering Together, John, Chris, and I, and that is true. But there are just so many dads in our network. And, 2 years ago, we held our first Father's Friday event where the Friday before Father's Day, we pushed dads to think about how to step out of their work roles and into their life roles. And we had 18 dads from across the globe join us on panels and conversations from every walk of life. And this year coming up for this Father's Day, we want to do something similar and just bringing all of those diverse voices together in a way that often gets overlooked or gets siloed into this one community here or this one community there, but really celebrating that diversity of experience.
That's a great way to end. John and Brian, thank you again for being my guest on the Company of Dads podcast.
Thanks, Paul.
Hey, thanks for listening to Company of Dads podcast. I hope you enjoyed it. But I'm here to tell you it's just one of the many offerings we have at the Company of Dads. We've got another podcast. We have a weekly newsletter. We have various features. We have events that we put on both online and in person. If you want to know about all of those, the best place to learn about them is to go to thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. That's thecompanyofdads.com/thedad. What do you get if you do that? That's how you sign up for our weekly newsletter, The Dad, which is a one-stop shop for all things lead dad. Thank you again for listening.